Hi, this is Dan Moran. Today, with great joy, I plan on taking you all on a short but very sweet journey into a most wonderful musical nostalgia. I do so in part as a tribute to one of the world's musical geniuses, one whose work is familiar and even precious to many of us, but one whose name has not been spoken very often and has remained in near total obscurity, despite the world's deep affection for his work. To begin, I must take you all back to the 1920s, when America fell in love with a fairly new art form, the motion picture. Movie houses were going up at a breakneck pace, and their patrons were being introduced to worlds they could not have imagined before. With all due respect to the likes of Chaplin and Keaton, Harold Lloyd and Fatty Arbuckle, perhaps the most enduring filmmaker of the comedy genre was one Hal Roach, who from his studios in Culver City, California, was producing not only the greatest comedy team in history, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, but a group of scruffy ruffians known as Our Gang, later called the Little Rascals. Some 75 years later, they are still adored by people of every race and culture, having achieved the aim of every artist, to be timeless. Roach began in the silent era when the science of soundtrack was primitive and involved merely scoring music to approximate the tenor of the film. In 1929, Roach technicians revolutionized filmmaking with the use of optical film, which allowed exact synchronization of sound and picture, but unfortunately introduced a hiss to the soundtrack, which could only be remedied by having continuous music in the background, thus burying the hiss produced by the projector. Hal Roach struck a deal with the Victor Talking Machine Company, engaging them to provide everything needed for the soundtracks of Roach's films, including the music itself. Victor dispatched their A&R man for the West Coast to Culver City, one Leroy Bernard Shield, who was to become the first and arguably the greatest film composer of all time. Shield, born in Waseca, Minnesota in 1893, was a touring concert pianist who went to work for Victor in 1923. In 1929 and 1930, his work was little more than the addition of organ music to Roach shorts using existing compositions. Slowly, he gained a feel for the Roach comedy style, and between 1929 and 1931, he wrote more than 60 tunes, the longest only 3 minutes in length. The recordings were made in the same building as the films themselves, and oftentimes on the spot to fill a specific need. The editors became adept at placing these short pieces in just the right sequence to add depth, pacing, and dramatic effect to the films. What Shield did was create a mood instantaneously, which allowed the Roach shorts, which were all nearly 20 minutes in length, to carry the emotions of the audience perfectly. Sadness, tension, love, melancholy, fear, laughter, even drunkenness were portrayed musically with incredible effect and precision. Leroy Shield's abilities were nothing short of miraculous. The editors began to fill each film, wall to wall, with the Shield pieces, often over the objections of Shield himself. In late 1930, Shield left Roach Studios for a position as conductor of the NBC Orchestra. There is barely a mention of him or his name in any of the film credits. In 1935, Shield returned to score the Laurel and Hardy feature, Our Relations, and a total of 51 new tunes were added to the Shield catalog of gems. In 1936, he returned to NBC, retiring as conductor in 1955. Leroy Shield passed away 35 years ago in Fort Lauderdale on January the 9th, 1962. What you are about to hear is also a miracle in itself. In 1992, an orchestra was formed in Amsterdam to play for an Oliver Hardy centennial celebration. The Bow Hunks took their name from a Laurel and Hardy film of the same name. Seeking the written scores, they found none, even in the vaults of Roach Studios. What faced them was the slow and meticulous transcription of all of the music of the Roach films from the films themselves. Note by note, they were reassembled under similar studio conditions and with the musicians on period instruments circled around 2 overhead microphones. The music was recorded live. As I listened to these 2 CD collections, I could feel my emotions rise and fall, and the images of Stan and Ollie, Jackie, Buckwheat, Farina, Stymie, Marianne, Weezer, Mickey, Spanky, and Joe danced in my head. Listen now for a few moments to the genius of Leroy Shield. Now, in his own words, on to the show. is Dan Moran, and you're listening to the music of Hal Roach's comedy films composed by the late Leroy Shield here on the Long Island Radio Magazine. That last piece was called The Good Old Days, and they certainly were. You've been listening to a sampling of recordings made by the Bow Hunks of the Netherlands of the works of one man, Leroy Shield, whose work is as timeless and perfect as that of Gershwin, Ellington, or Porter, but whose name was lost many decades ago. He could not have imagined the joy his music would bring to the world and just how new it is, even today. Leroy Shield, the world does remember you, and the hat of this correspondent is off to you. This is Dan Moran thanking you for joining me today here on the Long Island Radio Magazine. Until next time.